Good morning. Hello. Oh, I'm wearing red. I match. How are you guys doing today? Good morning. I slept in today. It was glorious. It was the first time this entire week I've been able to do that. I was so excited. I hope you guys can still hear the music kind of quietly in the back. Good morning or evening. Good night to Josh. I know you can't stay with us a long time, but that's okay. I want you to get all your sleeps in. I've got myself a cup of coffee in my Charleston mug. I shall show it off. Wonderful. Wonderful. I'm ready to, my plan is to finish this book today. It's been a good one. It's been a good one. Oh, red, red, and red. Look at all the matchy. But anyway, thank you guys for being here. If the music is too loud or too soft, please let me know so I can adjust it. Otherwise, I'm going to assume it's good. But yes, I've got coffee, I've got water. I'm going to take a few more sips of coffee and then jump in. Wonderful, wonderful. Hang on one second. Okay. Yes, wonderful. Alright, I'm gonna take one more sip of my coffee and we're just gonna jump right in. I just looked at the replay of me concentrating on my computer and my face is like... I guess it's what I look like when I'm concentrating. Alright, without further ado. Chapter 9. One of the greatest myths in the world, and the phrase greatest myths is just a fancy way of saying big fat lies, is that troublesome things get less and less troublesome if you do them more and more. People say this myth when they are teaching children to ride bicycles, for instance, as though falling off a bicycle and skinning your knee is less troublesome the 14th time you do it than the first time. The truth is that troublesome things tend to remain troublesome no matter how many times you do them, and that you should avoid doing them unless they are absolutely urgent. Obviously, it was absolutely urgent for the Baudelaire orphans to take another 3-hour climb down into the terrible darkness of the elevator shaft. The children knew that the Quagmire triplets were in grave danger, and that using Violet's invention to melt the bars of the cage was the only way that their friends could escape before Gunther hid them inside one of the items of the inn auction and smuggled them out of the city. But I'm sorry to say that the absolute urgency of the Baudelaire's second climb did not make it any less troublesome. The passageway was still as dark as a bar of extra dark chocolate sitting in a planetarium covered in a thick black blanket, even with the tiny glow from the white-hot tips of the fire tongs, and the sensation of lowering themselves down the elevator shaft still felt like a descent into the hungry mouth of some terrible creature. With only the clink of the extension cord hitting the lock of the cage to guide them, the three siblings pulled themselves down the Ersatz rope with one hand, and held out their welding torches with the other. And the trek into the tiny, filthy room where the triplets were trapped was still not even 1/27th okay. But the dreadful repetition of the Baudelaire's troublesome climb was dwarfed in comparison with the sinister surprise that they found at the bottom. A surprise so terrible that the three children simply refused to believe it. Violet reached the end of the final extension cord and thought it was a hallucination. Klaus stood looking at the cage and thought it must be a phantasm, and Sunny peered in through the bars and prayed that it was some combination of the two. The youngsters stared at the tiny, filthy room and stared at the cage, but it took them several minutes before they believed that the Quagmires were no longer inside. "They're gone," Violet said. They're gone, and it's all my fault. She threw her welding torch into the corner of the tiny room where it sizzled against the floor. She turned to her siblings, and they could see by the white glow of their tongues that their older sister was beginning to cry. My invention was supposed to save them, she said mournfully, and now Gunther has snatched them away. I'm a terrible inventor and a horrible friend. Klaus threw his welding torch into the corner and gave his sister a hug. You're the best inventor I know, he said, and your invention was a good one. Listen to those welding torches sizzle. The time just wasn't right for your invention, that's all. What's that supposed to mean? Violet said miserably. Sunny threw the last welding torch into the corner and took off her oven mitt so she could pat her sister comfortingly on the ankle. Noke, noke, she said, which meant there. All it means, Klaus said, is that you invented something that wasn't handy at this particular time. It's not your fault that we didn't rescue them, it's Gunther's. I guess I know that, Violet said, wiping her eyes. I'm just sad that the time wasn't right for my invention. Who knows if we will ever see our friends again? We will, Klaus said. Just because the time isn't right for your inventing skills doesn't mean the time isn't right for my researching skills. Dwaystall, Sunny said sadly, which meant all the research in the world can't help Duncan and Isadora now. But that's where you're wrong, Sunny, Klaus replied. Gunther may have snatched them, but we know where he's taking them. To Veblen Hall. He's gonna hide them inside one of the items at the inn auction, remember? Yes, Violet said, but which one? If we climb back up to the penthouse, Klaus said, and go to the Squalor Library, I think I can figure it out. Meotes, Sunny said, which meant, but the Squalor Library only has those snooty books on what's in and what's out. You're forgetting the recent addition to the library, Klaus said. Esme told us that Gunther had left a copy of the inn auction catalog, remember? Wherever he's planning to hide the Quagmires, it'll be listed in the catalog. If we can figure out which item he's hiding them in, we can get them out of there, Violet finished, before he auctions them off. That's brilliant, Klaus. It's no less brilliant than inventing welding torches, Klaus said. I just hope the time is right for this time. Me too, Violet said. After all, it's our only... Venung, Sunny said, which meant don't say it, and her sister nodded in agreement. There was no use in saying that it was their only hope, and getting them as anxious as they were before, so without another word the Baudelaires hoisted themselves back up on their makeshift rope and began climbing back up to the Squalor penthouse. The darkness closed in on them again, and the children began to feel as if their whole lives had been spent in this deep and shadowy pit instead of in a variety of locations ranging from a lumber mill in Paltryville to a cave on the shores of Lake Lachrymose to the Baudelaire mansion, which sat in charred remains just a few blocks away from Dark Avenue. But rather than think about all of the shadowy places in the Baudelaire past or the shadowiest place that they were climbing through now, the three siblings tried to concentrate on the brighter places in the Baudelaire future. They thought of the penthouse apartment, which drew closer and closer to them as they climbed. They thought of the Squalor Library, which could contain the proper information they needed to defeat Gunther's plan. And they thought of some glorious time that was yet to come, when the Baudelaires and the Quagmires could enjoy their friendship without the ghastly shadow of evil and greed that hung over them now. The Baudelaire orphans tried to keep their minds on these bright thoughts of the future as they climbed up the shadowy elevator shaft, and by the time they reached the sliding doors, they felt that perhaps this glorious time was not so far off. It must be almost morning, Violet said as she helped Sunny hoist herself up out of the elevator doors. We'd better untie our rope from the doorknob and shut these doors, otherwise the Squalors will see what we've been up to. Why shouldn't they see? Klaus asked. Maybe then they'd believe us about Gunther. No one ever believes us about Gunther, or any of Olaf's other disguises, Violet said, unless we have evidence. All we have now is an Ersatz elevator, an empty cage, and these three cooling fire tongs. That's not evidence of anything. I suppose you're right, Klaus said. Well, why don't you two untie the rope and I'll go straight to the library and start reading the catalog. Good plan, Violet said. Rehop, Sunny said, which meant, and good luck. Klaus quietly opened the door of the penthouse and let himself in, and the Baudelaire sisters began pulling the rope back up the shaft. The end of the last extension cord clinked and clinked against the walls of the passageway as Sunny wound up the Ersatz rope until it was a coil of extension cords, curtain pulls, and fancy neckties. Violet untied the last double knot to attach it from the doorknob and turned it to her sister. Let's store this under my bed, she said, in case we need it later. It's on the way to the library anyway. Yarrel, Sunny added, which meant, and let's shut the sliding elevator doors so the Squalors don't see we've been sneaking around the elevator shaft. Good thinking, Violet said, and pressed the up button. The door slid shut again, and after taking a good look around to make sure they hadn't left anything behind, the two Baudelaires walked into the penthouse and followed their breadcrumb trail past a breakfast room, down a hallway, across a standing room, down a hallway, and finally to Violet's room, where they stored the Ersatz rope under the bed. They were about to head right to the library when Sunny noticed a note that had been left on Violet's extra fluffy pillow. "Dear Violet," read Violet, "I couldn't find you or your siblings this morning to say goodbye. I had to leave early to buy yellow paper clips before heading over to the inn auction. Esme will take you to Veblen Hall at 10:30 sharp, so be sure to be ready or she'll be very annoyed. See you then. Sincerely yours, Jerome Squalor." "Yikes," Sunny said, pointing to the nearest of the 612 clocks that the Squalors owned. "Yikes is right," Violet said. "It's already 10 o'clock. All that climbing up and down the elevator shaft took so much longer than I thought." "Wretch," Sunny added, which meant something like, not to mention making those welding torches. "We'd better go to the library right away," Violet said. "Maybe we can help Klaus speed up the research process in some way." Sunny nodded in agreement, and the two sisters walked down the hallway to the Squalor library. Since Jerome had first shown it to them, Violet and Sunny had scarcely been inside, and it looked like nobody else had much used it either. A good library will never be too neat or too dusty, because somebody will always be in it, taking books off the shelves and staying up late reading them. Even libraries that were not to the Baudelaire's taste, Aunt Josephine's library, for instance, only contained books on grammar, were comfortable places to be in because the owners of the library used them so much. But the Squalor library was as neat and as dusty as it could be. All of the dull books on what was in and what was out sat on the shelves in tidy rows with layers of dust on top of them as if they hadn't been disturbed since they'd first been placed there. It made the Baudelaire sisters a little sad to see all those books sitting in the library unread and unnoticed, like stray dogs or lost children that nobody wanted to take home. The only sign of life in the library was their brother, who was reading the catalog so closely that he didn't look up until his sisters were standing at his side. "I hate to disturb you when you're researching," Violet said, "but there was a note from Jerome on my pillow. Esme's going to take us to Veblen Hall at 10:30 sharp, and it's just past 10. Is there any way we could help you?" "I don't see how," Klaus said, his eyes looking worried behind his glasses. "There's only one copy of the catalog, and it's pretty complicated. Each of the items for the auction is called a lot, and the catalog lists each lot with a description and a guess at what the highest bid may be. I've read up to lot number 49, which is a valuable postage stamp." "Well, Gunther can't hide the Quagmires in a postage stamp," Violet said. "You could skip that lot." "I've been skipping lots of lots," Klaus said, "but I'm still no closer to figuring out where the triplets will be." "Would Gunther hide them in lot number 14, an enormous globe? Would he hide them under the lid of lot 25, a rare and valuable piano? Would he hide them in lot 48, an enormous statue of a scarlet fish?" Klaus stopped and turned the page of the catalog. "Or would he hide them in lot 50, which is—" Klaus ended his sentence in a gasp, but his sisters knew immediately that he did not mean that the 50th item to be sold at the inn auction would be a sharp intake of breath. He meant he'd discovered something remarkable in the catalog, and they leaned forward to read over his shoulder and see what it was. "I can't believe it," Violet said. I simply can't believe it." "Tumsk," Sunny said, which meant something like, "This must be where the Quagmires will be hidden." "I agree with Sunny," Klaus said. "Even though there's no description of the item, they don't even write what the letters stand for." "We'll find out what they stand for," Violet said, "because we're going to find Esme right this minute and tell her what's going on. When she finds out, she'll finally believe us about Gunther, and we'll get the Quagmires out of lot number 50 before they leave the city. You were right, Klaus. The time was ripe for your researching skills." "I guess I was right," Klaus said. "I could scarcely believe our luck." The Baudelaires looked again at the page of the catalog, making sure that it was neither a hallucination nor a phantasm, and it wasn't. Right there, written in neat black type under the heading lot number 50, were 3 letters and 3 punctuation marks that seemed to spell out the solution to the Baudelaire's problems. The children looked at one another and smiled. All 3 siblings could scarcely believe their luck. The Baudelaire orphans could scarcely believe that those 3 letters spelled out the hiding place of the Quagmires as clearly as it spelled out VFD. End of chapter 9. Thank you for that, host Summer. Let me catch up on the chat. What is in right now? Light and still pinstripe suits, I think, and parsley soda. Good morning, Moocher. Research is a superpower. All your liquids melted together. You are so smart, Heartless Shroom. You're the smartest. Was that So VFD is these mysterious letters that the Baudelaires keep stumbling upon. They don't know what it means, but it keeps popping up in all of their like unfortunate events. There's significance to it. They just don't know what it is. So they're gonna hope that they've got it this time. I remember what it means, but I'm obviously not going to spoil until we get there in the game. Very fun doctors. Yep, that's it. It does stand for several things, but it also stands for, like, one thing. They use it for a lot of things, but it all goes back to, like, one thing. Volleyballing feet dogs. Sure. Sorry, I'm just taking a moment to enjoy this coffee. I'm liking this music. I think this is a winner of a playlist. Coffee. Rose Tyler alert. What do you mean? I confuse. As soon as I understand, if I do, I probably won't. Oh, licorice. As in candy. Got it. I don't know what the bad wolf thing is. I don't know. Oh, well. Okay, I'm gonna move on. Chapter 10. And one of the items in the catalog is listed as VFD, which is the secret that the Quagmires tried to tell us about right before they were kidnapped, Klaus finished. This is terrible, Esme said, and took a sip of the parsley soda she'd insisted on pouring for herself before the Baudelaire orphans could tell her everything they had discovered. Then she had insisted on settling herself on the innest couch in her favorite sitting room, and that the three children sit in 3 chairs grouped around her in a semicircle before they could relate the story of Gunther's true identity, the secret passageway behind the sliding elevator doors, the scheme to smuggle the Quagmires out of the city, and the surprising appearance of those 3 mysterious initials as the description of lot number 50. The 3 siblings were pleased that their guardian had not dismissed their findings or argued with them about Gunther or the Quagmires or anything else, but instead she had quietly and calmly listened to every detail. In fact, Esme was so quiet and calm that it was disconcerting, a word which here means a warning that the Baudelaire children did not heed in time. This is the least smashing thing I've ever heard, Esme said, taking another sip of her beverage. Okay, so let me see if I have understood everything you've said. So Gunther is in fact Count Olaf in disguise? Yes, Violet said. His boots are covering up his tattoo, his monocle makes him scrunch up his face to hide his one eyebrow. And he's hidden away the Quagmires in a cage at the bottom of my elevator shaft, Esme said, putting her soda glass down on a nearby table. Yes, Klaus said. There's no elevator behind those doors. Somehow Gunther removed it so he could use the shaft as a secret passageway. And now he's taken the Quagmires out of the cage, Esme continued, and is going to smuggle them out of the city by hiding them in lot number 50 in the inn auction. Zachrek, Sunny said, which meant, you got it, Esme. Well, this is certainly a complicated plot, Esme said. I'm surprised that young children such as yourself were able to figure it out, but I'm glad that you did. She paused for a moment and removed a speck of dust from one of her fingernails. There's only one thing to do now. We'll rush right to Veblen Hall and put a stop to this terrible scheme. We'll have Gunther arrested and the Quagmires set free. We'd better leave right this minute. Esme stood up and beckoned to the children with a faint smile. The children followed her out of the sitting room and past 12 kitchens to the front door, exchanging puzzled glances. Their guardian was right, of course, that they should go to Veblen Hall and expose Gunther and his treachery, but they couldn't help wondering why the city's 6th most important financial advisor was so calm when she said it. The children were so anxious about the Quagmires that they felt as if they were jumping out of their skin, but Esme led the Baudelaires out of the penthouse as if they were going to the grocery store to purchase whole wheat flour, instead of rushing to an auction to stop a horrible crime. As she shut the door of the apartment and turned to smile at the children again, the three siblings could see no sign of anxiousness on her face, and it was disconcerting. "Klaus and I will take turns carrying you, Sonny," Violet said, lifting her sister up. "That way the trip down the stairs will be easier for you." "Oh, we don't have to walk all down those stairs," Esme said. "That's true," Klaus said. "Sliding down the banisters would be quicker." Esme put one arm around the children and began walking them away from the front door. It was nice to receive an affectionate gesture from their guardian, but her arm was wrapped around them so tightly they could scarcely move, which was also disconcerting. "We won't have to slide down the banisters either," she said. "Then how will we get down from the penthouse?" Violet asked. Esme stretched out her other arm and used one of her long fingernails to press the up button next to the sliding doors. This was the most disconcerting thing of all, but by now I'm sorry to say it was too late. "We'll take the elevator," she said, as the doors slid open, and then with one last smile she swept her arm forward and pushed the Baudelaire orphans into the darkness of the elevator shaft. Sometimes words are not enough. There are some circumstances so utterly wretched that I cannot describe them in sentences or paragraphs or even a whole series of books, and the terror and woe that the Baudelaire orphans felt after Esme pushed them into the elevator shaft is one of the most dreadful circumstances that can be represented only with 2 pages of utter blackness. I have no words for the profound horror the children felt as they tumbled down into the darkness. I can think of no sentence that can convey how loudly they screamed or how cold the air was as it whooshed around them while they fell. And there is no paragraph I could possibly type that would enable you to imagine how frightened the Baudelaires were as they plunged towards certain doom. But I can tell you that they did not die. Not one hair on their heads has been harmed by the time the children finally stopped tumbling through the darkness. They survived the fall from the top of the shaft for the simple reason that they did not reach the bottom. Something broke their fall, a phrase which here means that the Baudelaire's plunge was stopped halfway between the sliding elevator doors and the metal cage where the Quagmires had been locked up. Something broke their fall without even injuring them, and though at first it felt like a miracle when the children understood that they were alive and no longer falling, they reached out their hands and soon realized that it felt a lot more like a net. While the Baudelaires were reading the catalog of the inn auction and telling Esme what they had learned, someone had stretched a rope net across the entire passageway, and it was this net that had stopped the children from plunging to their doom. Far, far above the orphans was the squalor penthouse, and far, far below them was the cage in the tiny, filthy room with the hallway leading out of it. The Baudelaire orphans were trapped. But it is far better to be trapped than to be dead, and the 3 children hugged each other in relief that something had broken their fall. "Spin set," Sonny said in a voice hoarse from screaming. "Yes, Sonny," Violet said, holding her close. "We're alive." She sounded as if she were talking as much to herself as to her sister. "We're alive," Klaus said, hugging them both. "We're alive and we're okay." "Well, I wouldn't say you were okay," Esme's voice called down to them from the top of the passageway. Her voice echoed off the walls of the passageway, but the children could still hear every cruel word. "You're alive, but you're definitely not okay. As soon as the auction is over and the Quagmires are on their way out of the city, Gunther will come and get you, and I can guarantee that you 3 orphans will never be okay again. What a wonderful and profitable day. My former acting teacher will finally get his hands on not 1, but 2 enormous fortunes." "Your former acting teacher?" Violet asked in horror. "You mean you've known Gunther's true identity this entire time?" "Of course I did," Esme called down. "I had just to fool you kids and my dim-witted husband into thinking he was really an auctioneer. Luckily, I am a smashing actress, so it was an easy trick to pull." "So you've been working together with that terrible villain?" Klaus called up to her. "How could you do that to us?" "He's not a terrible villain," Esme said. "He's a genius. I instructed the doorman not to let you out of the penthouse until Gunther came and retrieved you, but Gunther convinced me that throwing you down here was a better idea, and he was right. Now there's no way he'll make it to the auction and mess up our plans." "Zissalem!" Sonny shrieked. "My sister is right!" Violet cried. "You're our guardian. You're supposed to be keeping us safe, not throwing us down elevator shafts and stealing our fortune." "But I want to steal from you," Esme said. "I want to steal from you the way that Beatrice stole from me." "What are you talking about?" Klaus asked. "You're already unbelievably wealthy. Why do you want even more money?" "Because it's in, of course," Esme said. "Well, toodaloo, children. Toodaloo is the way of saying goodbye to 3 bratty orphans you're never going to see again." "Why?" Violet cried. "Why are you treating us so terribly?" Esme's answer to this question was the cruelest of all. And like a fall down an elevator shaft, there were no words for her reply. She merely laughed. A loud, rude cackle that bounced off the walls of the passageway and then faded into silence as their guardian walked away. The Baudelaire orphans looked at one another, or tried to look at one another in the darkness, and trembled, in disgust and fear, shaking the net that had trapped them and saved them at the same time. "Diley," Sunny said miserably, and her siblings knew that she meant, "What are we going to do?" "I don't know," Klaus said, "but we've got to do something. And we've got to do it quickly," Violet added, "but this is a very difficult situation. There's no use climbing up or down, the walls feel too smooth. And there's no use making a lot of noise to try to get someone's attention," Klaus said. "Even if anybody hears, they'll just think someone is yelling in one of the apartments." Violet closed her eyes in thought, although it was so dark that it didn't really make a difference if her eyes were closed or open. "Klaus, maybe the time is right for your researching skills," she said after a moment. "Can you think of some moment in history when people got out of a trap like this?" "I don't think so," Klaus replied sadly. "In the myth of Hercules, he's trapped between two monsters named Scylla and Charybdis, just like we're trapped between the sliding doors and the floor. But he got out of the trap by turning them into whirlpools." "Glaucus," Sunny said, which meant something like, "But we can't do that." "I know," Klaus said glumly. "Myths are often entertaining, but they're never very helpful. Maybe the time is right for one of Violet's inventions." "But I don't have any materials to work with," Violet said, reaching out her hand to feel the edges of the net. "I can't use this net for an invention because if I start to tear it up, we'll fall. The net seems to be attached to the wall with little metal pegs that stick into the walls, but I can't pull those out and use them either." "Gaisan?" Sunny asked. "Yes," Violet replied. "Pegs. Feel right here, Sunny. Gunther probably stood on a long ladder to drive these pegs into the wall of the passageway, and then strung the net across the pegs. I guess the walls of the elevator shaft are soft enough that small sharp objects could be stuck into them." "Folk?" Sunny asked, which meant, "like teeth?" And instantly her siblings knew what she was thinking. "No, Sunny," Violet said. "You can't climb up the elevator shaft using your teeth. That's too dangerous." "Yoit," Sunny pointed out, which meant something like, "But if I fall, I'll just fall back onto the net." "But what if you get stuck halfway up?" Klaus asked. "Or what if you lose a tooth?" "Vasta," Sunny said, which meant, "I'll just have to risk it. It's our only hope." And her siblings reluctantly agreed. They did not like the idea of the baby sister climbing up to the sliding doors of the Ersatz elevator, using only her teeth, but they could think of no other way to escape in time to foil Gunther's plan. The time wasn't ripe for Violet's inventing skills or for the knowledge Klaus had from his reading, but the time was ripe for Sunny's sharp teeth, and the youngest Baudelaire tilted her head back and then swung forward, sticking one of her teeth into the wall with a rough sound that would make any dentist weep for hours. But the Baudelaires were not dentists, and the three children listened closely in the darkness to hear if Sunny's tooth would stick as firmly as the net pegs. To their delight, they heard nothing. No scraping or sliding or cracking or anything that would indicate that Sunny's teeth wouldn't hold. Sunny even shook her head a little bit to see if it would easily dislodge her tooth from the wall, but it remained a firm tooth hold. Sunny swung her head slightly and embedded another tooth slightly above the first one. The second tooth stuck, so Sunny carefully eased out the first tooth and inserted it once more in the wall, slightly above the second tooth. By spacing her teeth slightly apart, Sunny had moved a few inches up the wall, and by the time she stuck her first tooth above the second one again, her little body was no longer touching the net. "Good luck, Sunny," Violet said. "We're rooting for you," Klaus said. Sunny did not reply, but her siblings were not alarmed, because they imagined it was difficult to say much when you had a mouthful of wall. So Violet and Klaus merely sat on their net and continued to call up encouragements to their baby sister. Had Sunny been able to climb and speak at the same time, she might have said "sorried," which meant something like "so far so good," or "yaff," which meant "I think I've reached the halfway point." But the two older Baudelaires heard nothing but the sound of her teeth inserting and detaching themselves in the dark, until Sunny triumphantly called down the word, "Top!" "Oh, Sunny!" Klaus cried. "You did it! Way to go!" Violet called up. "Now go get our makeshift rope from under the bed and we'll climb up and join you." "Gamba!" Sunny called back and crawled off. The two older siblings sat and waited in the darkness for a while, marveling at their sister's skills. "I wouldn't have climbed all the way up this passageway," Violet said, not when I was Sunny's age. "Me neither," Klaus said, "although we both have regular-sized teeth." "It's not just the size of her teeth," Violet said. "It's the size of her courage and the size of her concern for her siblings." "And the size of the trouble we're in," Klaus added, "and the size of our guardian's treachery. I can't believe Esme was scheming together with Gunther this entire time. She's as ersatz as her elevator." "Esme's a pretty good actress," Violet said comfortingly, "even though she's a terrible person. She had us completely fooled that Gunther had her completely fooled. But what was she talking about when she said, "Ta-da!" Sunny called down from the sliding doors. "She's the rope," Violet said excitedly. "Tie it to the doorknob, Sunny, using the devil's tongue." "No," Klaus said, "I have a better idea." "A better idea than climbing out of here?" Violet asked. "I want to climb out of here," Klaus said, "but I don't think we should climb up. Then we'll just be at the penthouse." "But from the penthouse," Violet said, "we can get to Veblen Hall. We can even slide down the banisters to save time." "But at the end of the banisters," Klaus said, "is the lobby of the building, and in the lobby is a doorman with strict instructions not to let us leave." "I hadn't thought about him," Violet said. "He always follows the instructions." "That's why we've got to leave 667 Dark Avenue another way," Klaus said. "Detamu," Sunny called down, which meant something like, "What other way is there?" "Down," Klaus said. "That tiny room at the bottom of the elevator shaft has a hallway leading out of it, remember? It's right next to the cage." "That's true," Violet said. "That must be how Gunther snatched the Quagmires away before we could rescue them, but who knows where it leads?" "Well, if Gunther took the Quagmires down that hallway," Klaus said, "it must lead to somewhere near Veblen Hall, and that's precisely where we want to go." "You're right," Violet said. "Sunny, forget about tying the rope to the doorknob. Someone might see it anyway and realize we've escaped. Just bring it down here. Do you think you can bite your way back down?" "Geronimo!" Sunny cried, which meant something like, "I don't need to bite my way back down." And the youngest Baudelaire was right. She took a deep breath and threw herself down the dark passageway, the coil of Ersatz rope trailing behind her. This time the plunge does not need to be represented by pages of darkness, because the terror of the long dark fall was alleviated. The word alleviated here means not particularly on Sunny's mind, because the youngest Baudelaire knew that Annette and her siblings were waiting for her at the bottom. With a thump, Sunny landed on the net, and with a slightly smaller thump, the coil of rope landed next to her. After making sure her sister was unharmed by the fall, Violet began tying one end of their rope to one of the pegs holding the net in place. "I'll make sure this end of the rope is secured," Violet said. "Sunny, if your teeth aren't too sore from the climb, use them to cut a hole in the net so we can climb through it." "What can I do?" Klaus asked. "You can pray this works," Violet said, but the Baudelaire sisters were so quick with their task that there was no time for even the shortest of religious ceremonies. In a matter of moments, Violet had attached the rope to the peg with some complicated and powerful knots, and Sunny had cut a child-sized hole in the middle of the net. Violet dangled the rope down the hole, and the three children listened until they heard the familiar clink of their ersatz rope against the metal cage. The Baudelaire orphans paused for a moment at the hole in the net and stared down into the blackness. "I cannot believe we're climbing down this passageway again," Violet said. "I know what you mean," Klaus said. "If someone had asked me that day at the beach if I ever thought we'd be climbing up and down an empty elevator shaft in an attempt to rescue a pair of triplets, I would have said never in a million years. And now we're doing it for the 5th time in 24 hours. What happened to us? What led us to this awful place we're staring at now?" "Misfortune," Violet said quietly. "A terrible fire," Klaus said. "Olaf," Sunny said decisively and began crawling down the rope. Klaus followed his sister down through the hole in the net, and Violet followed Klaus, and the three Baudelaires made the long trek down the bottom half of the passageway until they reached the tiny filthy room, the empty cage, and the hallway that they hoped would lead them to the inn auction. Sunny squinted up at their rope, making sure that her siblings had safely reached the bottom. Klaus squinted at the hallway, trying to see how long it was or if there was anybody or anything lurking in it, and Violet squinted in the corner at the welding torches the children had thrown in the corner when the time had not been ripe to use them. "We should take these with us," she said. "But why?" Klaus asked. "They've cooled off long ago." "They have," Violet said, picking one up, "and the tips are all bent from throwing them in the corner, but they still might come in handy for something. We don't know what we'll encounter in that hallway, and I don't want to come up short-handed. Here, Klaus, here's yours and here's Sunny's." The younger Baudelaires took the bent, cooled fire tongs, and then, sticking close to one another, all three children took their first few steps down the hallway. In the utter darkness of this terrible place, the fire tongs seemed like long, slender extensions of the Baudelaire's hands, instead of inventions that they were each holding. But this was not what Violet had meant when she said she didn't want them to be short-handed. Short-handed is a word which here means unprepared, and Violet was thinking that three children alone in a dark hallway holding fire tongs was perhaps a bit more prepared than three children alone in a dark hallway holding nothing at all. And I'm sorry to tell you that the eldest Baudelaire was absolutely right. The three children couldn't afford to be short-handed at all, not with the unfair advantage that was lurking at the end of their walk. As they took one cautious step after another, the Baudelaire orphans needed to be as long-handed as possible for the element of surprise that was waiting for them when the dark hallway came to an end. End of chapter 10. Let me catch up. Oh, Doctor Who. See, I'm the kind of person that likes to watch things in order, though, so I would want to watch, like, I would want to start in, like, the 60s for Doctor Who, and ain't nobody got time for that. You will go to sleep in, like, 5 minutes. Okay. 420 plays. Phew, they weren't harmed. I know, right? My heart. Oh, you're gonna stay till the chapter ends? Timmy Turner tea. The time is near. I think that was a Les Mis reference, if I'm remembering correctly. We can still say stuff with a mouthful of balls, just rude. Hi, Tara. Good morning. The me of the long dark fall. Oh my gosh. Thanks for noticing me. Eeyore was always my favorite in Pooh. Yeah, me too, Heartless Shroom. I'm sorry about the thunderstorm. I have an Eeyore plushie so the first time I ever went to Disney World, I was 10 years old. And, my parents were like, you know, we'll buy you one, or I think it was 2. Me and Sarah could each pick 2, souvenirs, for our week at Disney when I was 10 and Sarah was 6. And I picked a Tinkerbell, visor, because those were cool back in the early 2000s. I picked a Tinkerbell visor and a stuffed Eeyore. Those were my 2 things that I got from Disney World. Good night, Josh. Have a wonderful rest of the day. There's still a lot of missing episodes, so ain't nobody can do that. Oh yeah. I'm glad that you are officially chatting, but thank you for being here. I'm gonna take a few more sips of my coffee and then jump into chapter 11. We got 3 more chapters before this book is over. Get some sleep, Josh. Hopefully you can. This is really good, actually. I made myself a good cup this morning. I just realized I'm a freaking idiot. Hang on. This has been misspelled the whole time. I'm embarrassed. That has literally been misspelled the whole time. I'm so surprised that nobody on my YouTube has given me some sassy, nasty comment about that. I'm kind of glad you guys didn't notice, but at the same time, I'm like embarrassed that it was ever even misspelled. Oh boy. Alright, another sip of coffee and we're going back in. Thank you for host. Okay, here we go. Chapter 11. The French expression cul-de-sac describes what the Baudelaire orphans found when they reached the end of the dark hallway. And like all French expressions, it is most easily understood when you translate each French word into English. The word de, for instance, is a very common French word, so even if I didn't know a word of French, I would be certain that de means of. The word sac is less common, but I'm fairly certain that it means something like mysterious circumstances. And the word cul is such a rare French word that I am forced to guess at its translation, and my guess is that in this case it would mean at the end of the dark hallway, the Baudelaire children found an assortment. So the expression cul-de-sac here must mean, at the end of the dark hallway, the Baudelaire children found an assortment of mysterious circumstances. If the Baudelaires had been able to choose a French expression that would be waiting for them at the end of the hallway, they might have chosen one that meant, by the time the three children rounded the last corner of the corridor, the police had captured Gunther and rescued the Quagmire triplets. Or at least, the Baudelaires were delighted to see that the hallway led straight to Veblen Hall, where the in-auction was taking place. But the end of the hallway proved to be as mysterious and worrisome as the rest of it. The entire length of the hallway was very dark, and it had so many twists and turns that the three children frequently found themselves bumping into the walls. The ceiling of the hallway was very low. Gunther must have had to crouch when he used it for his treacherous plans. And over their heads, the three children could hear a variety of noises that told them where the hallway was probably taking them. After the first few curves, they heard the muted voice of the doorman and his footsteps as he walked overhead, and the Baudelaires realized they must be underneath the lobby of the Squalor's apartment building. After a few more curves, they heard two men discussing ocean decorations, and they realized they must be walking beneath Dark Avenue. And after a few more curves, they heard the rickety rattle of an old trolley that was passing over their heads, and the children knew that the hallway was leading them underneath one of the city's trolley stations. On and on the hallway curved, and the Baudelaires heard a variety of city sounds. The clopping of horses' hooves, the grinding of factory equipment, the tolling of church bells, and the clatter of people dropping things. But when they finally reached the corridor's end, there was no sound over their heads at all. The Baudelaires stood still and tried to imagine a place in the city where it was absolutely silent. "Where do you think we are?" Violet asked, straining her ears to listen even more closely. "It's as silent as a tomb up there." "That's not what I'm worried about," Klaus answered, poking the wall with his fire tong. "I can't find which way the hallway curves. I think we might be at a dead end." "A dead end?" Violet said, and poked the opposite wall with her tong. "It can't be a dead end. Nobody builds a hallway that goes nowhere." "Tragic," Sonny said, which meant Gunther must have ended up somewhere if he took this passageway. "I'm poking every inch of these walls," Klaus said grimly, "and there's no door or stairway or curve or anything. It's a dead end, all right. There's no other word for it. Actually, there's a French expression for dead end, but I can't remember what it is." "I guess we have to retrace our steps," Violet said miserably. "I guess we have to turn around and make our way back down the corridor and climb up to the net and have Sunny teeth her way to the penthouse and find some more materials to make an ersatz rope and climb all the way up to the top floor and slide down the banisters to the lobby and sneak past the doorman and run to Veblen Hall." "Pythian," Sunny said, which meant something like, "We'll never make it there in time to expose Gunther and save the Quagmires." "I know," Violet sighed, "but I don't know what else we could do. It looks like we're short-handed even with these tongs." "If we had some shovels," Klaus said, "we could try to dig our way out of the hallway, but we can't use the tongs as shovels." "Tinty," Sunny said, which meant, "If we had dynamite, we could blast our way out of the hallway, but we can't use tongs as dynamite." "But we might be able to use them as noisemakers," Violet said suddenly. "Let's bang on the ceiling with our tongs and see if we can attract the attention of someone who's passing by." "It doesn't sound like anyone's passing by," Klaus said, "but it's worth the try. Here, Sonny, I'll pick you up so your tongue can reach the ceiling, too." Klaus picked his sister up, and the three children began to bang on the ceiling, planning to make a racket that would last for several minutes. But as soon as their tongues first hit the ceiling, the Baudelaires were showered with black dust. It rained down on them like a dry, filthy storm, and the children had to cut short their banging to cough and rub their eyes and spit out the dust that had fallen into their mouths. "Ugh!" Violet spat. "That's terrible." "Tastes like burned toast," Klaus said. "Peflob!" Sunny shrieked. At that, Violet stopped coughing and licked the tip of her finger and thought. "It's ashes," she said. "Maybe we're below a fireplace." "I don't think so," Klaus said. "Look up." The Baudelaires looked up and saw that the black dust had uncovered a very small stripe of light, barely as wide as a pencil. The children gazed up into it and could see the morning gazing right back at them. "'Tis Sunny said, which meant, "Where in the city can you find ashes outdoors?" "Maybe we're below a barbecue pit," Klaus said. "Well, we'll find out soon enough," Violet replied, and began to sweep more dust away from the ceiling. As it fell on the children in a thick, dark cloud, the skinny stripe of light became 4 skinny stripes, like a drawing of a square on the ceiling. By the light of the square, the Baudelaires could see a pair of hinges. "Look," Violet said, "it's a trapdoor. We couldn't see it in the darkness of the hallway, but there it is." Klaus pressed his tongue against the trapdoor to try to open it, but it didn't budge. "It's locked, of course," he said. "I bet Gunther locked it behind him when he took the Quagmires away." Violet looked up at the trapdoor, and the other children could see by the light of the sun streaming in that she was tying her hair up in a ribbon to keep it out of her eyes. "A lock is not going to stop us," she said. "Not when we've come all this way. I think the time is finally ripe for these tongs." Not as welding torches, and not as noisemakers. She smiled and turned her attention to the siblings. We can use them as crowbars, she said excitedly. Heard a set? Sunny asked. A crowbar is sort of a portable lever, Violet said, and these tongs will work perfectly. We'll stick the bent end into the part where the light's shining through, and then push the rest of the tong sharply down. It'll bring the trapdoor down with it. Understand? I think so, Klaus said. Let's try. The Baudelaires tried. Carefully, they stuck the part of the tongs that had been heated in the oven into one side of the square of light. And then, grunting with the effort, they pushed the straight end of the tongs down as sharply as they could, and I'm happy to report that the crowbars worked perfectly. With a tremendous crackling sound and another cloud of ashes, the trapdoor bent on its hinges and opened toward the children, who had to duck as it swung over their heads. Sunlight streamed into the hallway, and the Baudelaires saw that they had finally come to the end of their long, dark journey. It worked! Violet cried. It really worked! The time was ripe for your inventing skills, Klaus cried. The solution was right on the tip of our tongs. Up! Sunny shrieked, and the children agreed. By standing on tiptoe, the Baudelaires could grab hold of the hinges and pull themselves out of the hallway, leaving behind their crowbars, and in a moment the three children were squinting in the sunlight. One of my most prized possessions is a small wooden box with a special lock on it that is more than 500 years old and works according to a secret code my grandfather taught me. My grandfather learned it from his grandfather, and his grandfather learned it from his grandfather, and I would teach it to my grandchild if I thought I would ever have a family of my own, instead of living out the remainder of my days all alone in this world. The small wooden box is one of my most prized possessions because when the lock is opened according to the code, a small silver key may be found inside, and the key fits the lock on one of my other most prized possessions, which is a slightly larger wooden box given to me by a woman whom my grandfather always refused to speak about. Inside this slightly larger wooden box is a roll of parchment, a word which here means some very old paper printed with a map of the city at the time when the Baudelaire orphans lived in it. The map has every single detail of the city written down in dark blue ink, with measurements of buildings and sketches of costumes and charts of changes in the weather, all added in the margins by the map's 12 previous owners, all of whom are now dead. I have spent more hours than I can ever count going over every inch of this map as carefully as possible, so that everything can be learned from it can be copied into my files and into books such as this one, in the hopes that the general public will finally learn every detail of the treacherous conspiracy I have spent my life trying to escape. The map contains thousands of fascinating things that have been discovered by all sorts of explorers, criminal investigators, and circus performers over the years, but the most fascinating thing that the map contains was discovered just at this moment by the three Baudelaire children. Sometimes in the dead of night, when I cannot sleep, I rise from my bed and work the code on the small wooden box to retrieve the silver key that opens the slightly larger wooden box, so I can sit at my desk and look once again by candlelight at the two dotted lines indicating the underground hallway that begins at the bottom of the elevator shaft at 667 Dark Avenue and ends at the trapdoor that the Baudelaires managed to open with their Ersatz crowbars. I stare and stare at the part of the city where the orphans climbed out of that ghastly corridor, but no matter how much I stare, I can scarcely believe my own eyes any more than the youngsters could believe theirs. The siblings had been in darkness for so long that their eyes took a long time to get used to the properly lit surroundings, and they stood for a moment rubbing their eyes and trying to see exactly where this trapdoor had led them. But in the sudden brightness of the morning, the only thing the children could see was the chubby shadow of a man standing near them. "Excuse me," Violet called while her eyes were still adjusting. "We need to get to Veblen Hall. It's an emergency. Could you tell me where it is?" "Just two blocks that way?" The shadow stuttered, and the children gradually realized that it was a slightly overweight mailman pointing down the street and looking at the children pretty fearfully. "Don't hurt me," the mailman added, stepping away from the youngsters. "We're not going to hurt you," Klaus said, wiping ashes off his glasses. "Ghosts always say that," the mailman says, "and then they hurt you anyway." "We're not ghosts," Violet said. "Don't tell me you're not ghosts," the mailman replied. "I just saw you rise out of the ashes myself as if you'd come from the center of the earth. People have always said it's haunted here on the empty lot where the Baudelaire mansion burned down, and now I know it's very true." The mailman ran away before the Baudelaires could reply, but the three children were so amazed by his words to speak to him anyway. They blinked and blinked in the morning sun, and finally their eyes adjusted enough to see that the mailman was right. It was true. It was not true that the three children were ghosts, of course. They were not spooky creatures who had risen from the center of the earth, but the 3 orphans who had hoisted themselves out of the hallway. But the mailman had spoken the truth when he told them where they were. The Baudelaire orphans looked around them and huddled together as if they were still in a dark hallway instead of outdoors, in broad daylight, standing amid the ashy ruins of their destroyed home. End of chapter 11. It's locked. Tip of our tongues. Alfred Hitchcock jumps into the picture to help the orphans. Thank you for the applause. Only 2 more chapters to go, friends. I am dancing. I need a dance break counter. Okay. Okay. Here we go. Chapter 12. Several years before the Baudelaires were born, Veblen Hall won the prestigious Door Prize, an award given each year to the city's best constructed opening. And if you ever find yourself standing in front of Veblen Hall as the Baudelaire orphans did that morning, you will immediately see why the committee awarded the shiny pink trophy to the door's polished wooden planks, its exquisite brass hinges, and its gorgeous shiny doorknob, fashioned out of the world's second finest crystal. But the 3 siblings were in no state to appreciate architectural detail. Violet led the way up the stairs to Veblen Hall, and grabbed the doorknob without a thought to the ashy smear she would leave on its polished surface. If I had been with the Baudelaires, I would have never opened the award-winning door. I would have considered myself lucky to have gotten out of the net suspended in the middle of the elevator shaft and to have escaped Gunther's evil plan, and I would have fled to some remote corner of the world and hid from Gunther and his associates for the rest of my life, rather than risk another encounter with this treacherous villain. An encounter, I'm sorry to say, that will only bring more misery into the 3 orphans' lives. But these 3 children were far more courageous than I shall ever be, and they paused just for a moment to gather all of this courage up and use it. Beyond this doorknob, Violet said, is our last chance at revealing Gunther's true identity and his terrible plans. Just past those brass hinges, Klaus said, is our final opportunity to save the Quagmires from being smuggled out of the country. Sorusu, Sunny said, which meant behind those wooden planks lies the answer to the mystery of VFD and why the secret hallway led us to the place where the Baudelaire mansion burned to the ground, killing our parents and beginning this series of unfortunate events that haunt us wherever we go. The Baudelaires looked at one another and stood up as straight as they could, as if their backbones were as strong as their courage, and Violet opened the door of Veblen Hall, and instantly the orphans found themselves in the middle of a hubbub, a word which here means a huge crowd of people in an enormous fancy room. Veblen Hall had a very high ceiling, a very shiny floor, and one massive window that had won first runner-up for the window prize for the previous year. Hanging from the ceiling were 3 huge banners, one with the word "in" written on it, one with the word "auction" written on it, and one last one twice as big as the others with a huge portrait of Gunther. Standing on the floor were at least 200 people, and the Baudelaires could tell that it was a very in crowd. Almost everyone was wearing pinstripe suits, sipping tall, frosty glasses of parsley soda, and eating salmon puffs offered by some costume waiters from Cafe Salmonella, which had apparently been hired to cater the auction. The Baudelaires were in regular clothes rather than pinstripes, and they were covered in dirt from the tiny filthy room at the bottom of the elevator shaft, and in ashes from the Baudelaire lot where the hallway had led them. The in-crowd would have frowned upon such attire had they noticed the children, but everyone was too busy gazing at the far end of the room to turn around and see who had walked through the award-winning door. For at the far end of Veblen Hall, underneath the biggest banner and in front of the massive window, Gunther was standing up on a small stage and speaking into a microphone. On one side of him was a small glass vase with blue flowers painted on it, and on the other was Esme, who was sitting in a fancy chair and gazing at Gunther as if he were the cat's pajamas, a phrase which here means a charming and handsome gentleman instead of a cruel and dishonest villain. "Lot 46, please," Gunther was saying into the microphone. With all of their exploration of dark passageways, the Baudelaires had almost forgotten that Gunther was pretending he wasn't fluent in English. "Please, gentlemen and ladies, see the vase with blue flowers. Vases in, glass in, flowers in, please, especially the flowers that are blue. Who bid?" 100, called out a voice from the crowd. 150, another voice said. 200, another said. 250, returned the person who had bid first. 253, another said. "We're just in time," Klaus whispered to Violet. "VFD is lot 50. Do we wait to speak up until then, or do we confront Gunther right now?" "I don't know," Violet whispered back. "We were so focused on getting to Veblen Hall in time, I forgot to think up a plan of action." "Is 253 last bidding of people, please?" Gunther asked into the microphone. "Okay, here is vase, please. Give money, please, to Mrs. Squalor." A pinstriped woman walked to the edge of the stage and handed a stack of bills to Esme, who smiled greedily and handed her the vase in exchange. Watching Esme count the pile of bills and then calmly place them in her pinstripe purse while somewhere backstage the Quagmires were trapped inside whatever VFD was, made the Baudelaires feel sick to their stomachs. "Avelmer," Sunny said, which meant, "I can't stand it any longer. Let's tell everyone in this room what's really going on." "Excuse me," said somebody, and the three children looked up to see a stern-looking man peering down at them from behind some very large sunglasses. He was holding a salmon puff in one hand and pointing at the Baudelaires at the other. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave Veblen Hall at once," he said. "This is the inn auction. It's no place for grimy little children like yourselves." "But we're supposed to be here," Violet said, thinking quickly. "We're meeting our guardians." "Don't make me laugh," the man said, although it looked like he'd never laughed in his life. "What sort of people would be caring for such dirty little kids?" "Jerome and Esme Squalor," Klaus said. "We've been living in their penthouse." "We'll see about this," the man said. "Jerry, get over here." At the sound of the man's raised voice, a few people turned around and looked at the children, but almost everyone kept listening to Gunther as he began to auction off lot 47, which he explained was a pair of ballet slippers, please, made from chocolate. Jerome detached himself from a small circle of people and walked over to a stern man to see what the matter was. When he caught sight of the orphans, he looked as if you would have knocked him over with a feather, a phrase which here means he seemed happy but extremely surprised to see them. "I'm very happy to see you," he said, "but extremely surprised. Esme told me you weren't feeling very well." "So you know these children, Jerome?" the man in sunglasses said. "Of course I know them," Jerome replied. "They're the Baudelaires. I was just telling you about them." "Oh, yes," the man said, losing interest. "Well, if they're orphans, I guess it's okay for them to be here. But, Jerry, you've got to buy them some new clothes." The man walked away before Jerome could reply. "I don't like to be called Jerry," he admitted to the children, "but I don't like to argue with them either." "Well, Baudelaires, are you feeling better?" The children stood for a moment and looked up at their guardian. They noticed he had a half-eaten salmon puff in his hand, even though he'd told the siblings he didn't like salmon. Jerome had probably not wanted to argue with the waiters in the salmon costumes either. The Baudelaires looked at him and then looked at one another. They did not feel better at all. They knew that Jerome would not want to argue with them if they told him once more about Gunther's true identity. He would not want to argue with Esme if they told him about her part in the treacherous scheme, and he would not want to argue with Gunther if they told him that the Quagmires were trapped inside one of the items at the inn auction. The Baudelaires did not feel better at all, as they realized that the only person who could help them was someone who could be knocked over with a feather. "Minrov?" Sunny said. "Minrov?" Jerome replied, smiling down at the littlest Baudelaire. "What does Minrov mean?" "I'll tell you what it means," Klaus said, thinking quickly. Perhaps there was a way to have Jerome help them without making him argue with anyone. "It means, would you do us a favor, Jerome?" Violet and Sunny looked at their brother curiously. Minrov didn't mean, "Would you do us a favor, Jerome?" and Klaus most certainly knew that. Minrov meant something more like, "Should we try to tell Jerome about Gunther and Esme and the Quagmire triplets?" But the sisters kept quiet, knowing that Klaus must have a good reason to lie to his guardian. "Of course I'll do you a favor," Jerome said. "What is it?" My sisters and I would really like to own one of the lots at this auction, Klaus said. We were wondering if you would buy it for us as a gift. I suppose so, Jerome said. I didn't know you three were interested in inn items. Oh, yes, Violet said, understanding at once what Klaus was up to. We're very anxious to own lot 50, VFD. VFD? Jerome asked. What does that stand for? It's a surprise, Klaus said quickly. Would you bid for it? If it's very important to you, Jerome said. I suppose I will, but I don't want you to get spoiled. You certainly arrived in time. It looks like Gunther's just finishing up the bidding on those ballet shoes, so we're coming right up to lot 50. Let's go watch the auction from where I was standing. There's an excellent view of the stage, and there's a friend of yours standing with me. A friend of ours? Violet asked. You'll see, Jerome said, and they did see. When they followed Jerome across the enormous room to watch the auction underneath the inn banner, they found Mr. Poe holding a glass of parsley soda and coughing into his white handkerchief. You could knock me over with a feather, Mr. Poe said when he was done coughing. What are you Baudelaires doing here? What are you doing here? Klaus asked. You told us you would be on a helicopter ride to a mountain peak. Mr. Poe paused to cough into his white handkerchief again. The reports about the mountain peak turned out to be false, Mr. Poe said when the coughing fit had passed. I now know for certain that the Quagmire twins are being forced to work at a glue factory nearby. I'm heading over there later, but I wanted to stop by the inn auction. Now that I'm vice president in charge of orphan affairs, I'm making more money, and my wife wanted to see if I could buy a bit of ocean decoration. But, Violet started to say, but Mr. Poe shushed her. Shush, he said. Gunther is beginning lot number 48, and that's what I want to bid on. Please, lot 48, Gunther announced. His shiny eyes regarded the crowd from behind his monocle, but he did not appear to spot the Baudelaires. Is large statue of fish, painted red, please. Very big, very in. Big enough to sleep inside this fish if you are in the mood, please. Who bid? I bid, Gunther, Mr. Poe called out. 100. 200, called out another voice from the crowd. Klaus leaned in close to Mr. Poe to talk to him without Jerome hearing. Mr. Poe, there's something you should know about Gunther, he said, thinking that if he could convince Mr. Poe, then the Baudelaires wouldn't have to continue their charade, a word which here means pretending to want VFD so Jerome would bid on it and save the Quagmires without knowing it. He's really an auctioneer, I know, Mr. Poe finished for him and bid again. 206. 300, replied the other voice. No, Violet said. He's not really an auctioneer at all. He's Count Olaf in disguise. 312, Mr. Poe called out, and then frowned down at the children. Don't be ridiculous, he said to them. Count Olaf is a criminal. Gunther is just a foreigner. I can't remember for the word for fear of foreigners, but I'm surprised that you children have such a fear. 400, called out the other voice. The word xenophobia, Klaus said, but that doesn't apply here because Gunther's not really a foreigner. He's not even really Gunther. Mr. Poe took out his handkerchief again, and the Baudelaires waited as he coughed into it before replying. You're not making any sense, he said finally. Can we please discuss this after I buy this ocean decoration? I bid 409. 500, called out the other voice. I give up, Mr. Poe said, and coughed into his handkerchief. 500 is too much to pay for a big herring statue. 500 is highest bid, please, Gunther said, and smiled at someone in the crowd. Please will the winner give money to Mrs. Squalor, please? Why, look, children, Jerome said. The doorman bought that big red fish. The doorman? Mr. Poe said as the doorman handed Esme a sack of coins and with difficulty lifted the enormous red fish statue off the stage, his hands still hidden in his long sleeves. I'm surprised the doorman can afford to buy anything at the inn auction. He told me once he was an actor, too, Jerome said. He's an interesting fellow. Care to meet him? That's very nice of you, Mr. Poe said and coughed into his handkerchief. I'm certainly meeting all sorts of interesting people since my promotion. The doorman was struggling past the children with his scarlet herring when Jerome tapped him on the shoulder. Come meet Mr. Poe, he said. I don't have time to meet anyone, the doorman replied. I have to get this in the boss's truck, and... The doorman stopped mid-sentence when he caught sight of the Baudelaire children. You're not supposed to be here, he said. You're not supposed to have left the penthouse. Oh, but they're feeling better now, Jerome said, but the doorman wasn't listening. He had turned around, swatting several pinstripe members of the crowd with his fish statue as he did so, and was calling up to the people on the stage. Hey, boss, he said, and both Esme and Gunther turned to look as he pointed at the three Baudelaires. Orphans are here! Esme gasped, and she was so affected by the element of surprise she almost dropped her sack of coins, but Gunther merely turned his head and looked directly at the children. His eyes shone very bright, even the one behind his monocle, and the Baudelaires were horrified to recognize that expression. Gunther was smiling as if he'd just told a joke, and it was an expression he wore when his treacherous mind was working its hardest. Orphans Inn, he said, still insisting on pretending he could not speak English properly. Okay for orphans to be here, please. Esme looked curiously at Gunther, but then shrugged and gestured to the doorman with a long-nailed hand that everything was okay. The doorman shrugged back at her and then gave the Baudelaires a strange smile and walked out of the award-winning door. "We will skip lot 49, please," Gunther continued. "We will bid on lot 50, please, and then please auction is over." "But what about all the other items?" someone called. "Skip 'em," Esme said dismissively. "I've made enough money today." "I never thought I'd heard Esme say that," Jerome muttered. "Lot 50, please," Gunther announced and pushed an enormous cardboard box onto the stage. It was as big as the fish statue, just the right size for storing 2 small children. The box had VFD printed on it in big black letters, and the Baudelaires saw that some tiny air holes had been poked in the top. The 3 siblings could picture their friends trapped inside the box and terrified that they were about to be smuggled out of the city. "VFD, please," Gunther said. "Who bid?" "I bid 20, Jerome said and winked at the children. "What in the world is VFD?" Mr. Poe asked. Violet knew she had no time to try to explain everything to Mr. Poe. "It's a surprise," she said. "Stick around and find out." 50, said another voice, and the Baudelaires turned to see that this second bid had come from the man in sunglasses who'd asked them to leave. "That doesn't look like one of Gunther's assistants," Klaus whispered to his sisters. "You never know," Violet replied. "They are hard to spot." 55, Jerome called out. Esme frowned at him and then gave the Baudelaires a very mean glare. 100, the man in sunglasses said. "Goodness, children," Jerome said. "This is getting very expensive. Are you sure you want this VFD?" "You're buying this for the children?" Mr. Poe said. "Please, Mr. Squalor, don't spoil these youngsters." "He's not spoiling us," Violet said, afraid that Gunther would stop the bidding. "Please, Jerome, please buy lot 50 for us. We'll explain everything later." Jerome sighed. "Very well," he said. "I guess it's only natural that you'd want some in things after spending some time with Esme. I bid 108. 200, the man in sunglasses said. The Baudelaires craned their necks to try to get a better look at him, but the man in sunglasses didn't look any more familiar. 204, Jerome said, and then looked down at the children. "I won't bid any higher, children. This is getting much too expensive, and bidding is too much like arguing for me to really enjoy this." 300, the man in sunglasses said, and the Baudelaire children looked at one another in horror. What could they do? Their friends were about to slip out of their grasp. "Please, Jerome," Violet said. "I beg of you, please buy this for us." Jerome shook his head. "Someday you'll understand," he said. "It's not worth it to spend money on silly things." Klaus turned to Mr. Poe. "Mr. Poe," he said, "would you be willing to loan us some money from the bank?" "To buy a cardboard box," Mr. Poe said. "I should say not. Ocean decorations are one thing, but I don't want you children wasting money on a box of something, no matter what it is." "Final bid is 300, please," Gunther said, turning and giving Esme a monocled wink. "Please, sir, 1,000! Gunther stopped at the sound of a new bidder for lot 50. Esme's eyes widened, and she grinned at the thought of putting such an enormous sum in her pinstripe purse. The in-crowd looked around, trying to figure out where this new voice was coming from, but nobody suspected such a long and valuable word would originate in the mouth of a tiny baby who was no bigger than a salami. 1,000! Sunny shrieked again, and her siblings held their breath. They knew, of course, that their sister had no sum of money, but they hoped that Gunther would not see where the bid was coming from and would be too greedy to find out. The Ersatz auctioneer looked at Esme and then again out into the crowd. "Where in the world did Sunny get that kind of money?" Jerome asked Mr. Poe. "Well, when the children were in boarding school," Mr. Poe answered. "Sunny worked as a receptionist, but I had no idea her salary was that high." 1,000! Sunny insisted, and finally Gunther gave in. "The highest bid is now 1,000, he said, and then remembered to pretend he wasn't fluent in English. "Please," he added. "Good grief," the man in sunglasses said. "I'm not going to pay more than 1,000 for VFD. That's not worth it." "It is to us," Violet said fiercely, and the 3 children walked toward the stage. Every eye in the crowd fell on the siblings as they left an ashy trail behind them on their way to the cardboard box. Jerome looked confused. Mr. Poe looked befuddled, a word which here means as confused as Jerome. Esme looked vicious. The man in sunglasses looked like he'd lost an auction, and Gunther kept smiling as if a joke he had told was only getting funnier and funnier. Violet and Klaus climbed up on the stage and then hoisted Sunny up alongside them, and the 3 orphans looked fiercely at the terrible man who had imprisoned their friends. "Give your 1,000, please, to Mrs. Squalor," Gunther said, grinning down at the children, "and then auction is over." "The only thing that is over," Klaus said, "is your horrible plan." "Silko," Sunny agreed, and then using her teeth, even though they were still sore from climbing up the elevator shaft, the youngest Baudelaire bit into the cardboard box and began ripping it apart, hoping she wasn't hurting Duncan and Isadora Quagmire as she did so. "Wait a minute, kids," Esme snarled, getting out of her fancy chair and stomping over to the box. "You can't open the box until you give me money. That's illegal." "What's illegal," Klaus said, "is auctioning off children, and soon this whole room will see you've broken the law." What's this? Mr. Poe asked, striding toward the stage. Jerome followed him, looking for the orphans, from the orphans to his wife in confusion. The Quagmire triplets are in this box, Violet explained, helping her sister tear it open. Gunther and Esme are trying to smuggle them out of the country. What? Jerome cried. Esme, is this true? Esme did not reply, but in a moment everyone would see if it was true or not. The children had torn away a large section of the cardboard, and they could see a layer of white paper inside, as if Gunther had wrapped the Quagmires the way you might have the butcher wrap up a pair of chicken breasts. Hang on, Duncan, Violet called into the paper. Just a few more seconds, Isadora. We're getting you out of here. Mr. Poe frowned and coughed into his white handkerchief. Now look here, Baudelaires, he said sternly when his coughing spell was over. I have reliable information that the Quagmires are in a glue factory, not inside this cardboard box. We'll see about that, Klaus said, and Sonny gave the box another big bite. With a loud shredding sound, it split right down the middle, and the contents of the box spilled out all over the stage. It is necessary to use the expression a red herring to describe what was inside the cardboard box. A red herring, of course, is a type of fish, but it is also an expression that means a distracting and misleading clue. Gunther had used the initials VFD on the box to mislead the Baudelaires into thinking that their friends were trapped inside, and I am sorry to tell you that the Baudelaires did not realize it was a red herring until they looked around the stage and saw what the box contained. End of chapter 12. Do as we say, Tony Hale. Very fine, Dr. Terror House of Horror. Hello, Holland. Good morning. Thank you for shouting her out. A wolf can eat 20 pounds of meat in a single meal, which... Just take those old records off the shelf. I said listen to them by myself. A wolf can eat 20 pounds of meat in a single meal, which would be akin to a human eating 100 hamburgers. Woo! Woo! We have one more chapter, friends. Now I really want a cheeseburger. Okay, one more chapter. You guys ready? Basically, I have the appetite of a wolf. Okay, chapter 13. These are doilies, Violet cried. This box is full of doilies! And it was true. Scattered around the stage, spilling out of the remains of the cardboard box, were hundreds and hundreds of small round napkins with a strip of lace around them. The sort of napkins that you might use to decorate a plate of cookies at a fancy tea party. Of course, the man in sunglasses said. He approached a stage and removed his sunglasses, and the Baudelaires could see that he wasn't one of Gunther's associates after all. He was just a bidder in a pinstripe suit. I was going to give them to my brother for a birthday present. They're very fancy doilies. What else could VFD stand for? Yes, Gunther said, smiling at the children. What else could it stand for, please? I don't know, Violet said, but the Quagmires didn't find out about a secret fancy napkins. Where have you put them, Olaf? What is Olaf, please? Gunther asked. Now, Violet, Jerome said, we agreed that we wouldn't argue about Gunther anymore. Please excuse these children, Gunther. I think they must be ill. We're not ill, Klaus cried. We've been tricked. This box of doilies was a red herring. But the red herring was lot 48, someone in the crowd said. Children, I'm very disturbed by your behavior, Mr. Poe said. You look like you haven't washed in a week. You're spending your money on ridiculous items. You run around accusing everybody of being Count Olaf in disguise. And now you've made a big mess of doilies on the floor. Someone's likely to trip and fall on all these slippery napkins. I would have thought that the squallers would be raising you better than this. Well, we're not going to raise them anymore, Esme said, not after they've made such a spectacle of themselves. Mr. Poe, I want these terrible children placed out of my care. It's not worth it to have orphans, even if they're in. Esme, Jerome cried. They lost their parents. Where else could they go? Don't argue with me, Esme snapped, and I'll tell you where they can go. They can... With me, please, Gunther said, and placed one of his scraggly hands on Violet's shoulder. Violet remembered when this treacherous villain had plotted to marry her and shuddered underneath his greedy fingers. I am loving of the children. I would be happy, please, to raise 3 children of my own. He put his other scraggly hand on Klaus's shoulder and then stepped forward as if he was going to put one of his boots on Sonny's shoulder, so all 3 Baudelaires would be locked in a sinister embrace. But Gunther's foot did not land on Sonny's shoulder, it landed on a doily, and in a second Mr. Poe's prediction that someone would trip and fall came true. With a papery thump, Gunther was suddenly on the ground, his arms flailing wildly in the doilies and his legs flailing madly on the floor of the stage. Please, he shouted as he hit the ground, but his wiggling limbs only made him slip more, and the doilies began to spread out across the stage and fall to the floor of Veblen Hall. The Baudelaires watched the fancy napkins flutter around them, making flimsy, whispering sounds as they fell, but then they heard 2 weighty sounds, one after the other, as if Gunther's fall had made something heavier fall to the floor. When they turned their heads to follow the sound, they saw Gunther's boots lying on the floor, one at Jerome's feet and one at Mr. Poe's. Please, Gunther shouted again as he struggled to stand up, but when he finally got to his feet, everyone else in the room was looking at them. Look, the man who had been wearing sunglasses said. The auctioneer wasn't wearing any socks. That's not very polite. And look, someone else said, he has a doily stuck between 2 of his toes. That's not very comfortable. And look, Jerome said, he has a tattoo of an eye on his ankle. He's not Gunther. He's not an auctioneer, Mr. Poe cried. He's not even a foreigner. He's Count Olaf. He's more than Count Olaf, Esme said, walking slowly toward the terrible villain. He's a genius. He's a wonderful acting teacher, and he's the handsomest, innest man in town. Don't be absurd, Jerome said. Ruthless kidnapping villains aren't in. You're right, said Count Olaf, and what a relief it is to call him by his proper name. Olaf tossed away his monocle and put his arm around Esme. We're not in. We're out. Out of the city. Come on, Esme. With a shriek of laughter, Olaf took Esme's hand and leaped from the stage, elbowing aside the in-crowd as he began running toward the exit. They're escaping, Violet cried, and jumped off the stage to chase after them. Klaus and Sonny followed her as fast as their legs could carry them, but Olaf and Esme had longer legs, which in this case was just as unfair an advantage as the element of surprise. By the time the Baudelaires had run to the banner with Gunther's face on it, Olaf and Esme had reached the banner with auction printed on it, and by the time the children had reached that banner, the 2 villains had run past the inn banner and through the award-winning door of Veblen Hall. Egad, Mr. Poe cried. We can't let that dreadful man escape for the 6th time. After him, everyone. That man is wanted for a wide variety of violent and financial crimes. The in-crowd sprang into action and began chasing after Olaf and Esme, and you may choose to believe, as this story nears its conclusion, that with so many people chasing after this wretched villain, it would be impossible for him to escape. You may wish to close this book without finishing it, and imagine that Olaf and Esme were captured, and that the Quagmire triplets were rescued, and that the true meaning of VFD was discovered, and that the mystery of the secret hallway to the ruined Baudelaire mansion was solved, and that everyone held a delightful picnic to celebrate all this good fortune, and that there was enough ice cream sandwiches to go around. I certainly wouldn't blame you for imagining these things, because I imagine them all the time. Late at night, when not even the map of the city can comfort me, I close my eyes and imagine all those happy, comforting things surrounding the Baudelaire children, instead of all those doilies that surrounded them, and brought yet another scoop of misfortune into their lives. Because when Count Olaf and Esme Squalor flung open the door of Veblen Hall, they let in an afternoon breeze that made all the very fancy doilies flutter over the Baudelaire's heads and then settle back down on the floor behind them, and in one slippery moment the entire in-crowd was falling all over one another in a papery pinstripe blur. Mr. Poe fell on Jerome, Jerome fell on the man who had been wearing sunglasses, and his sunglasses fell on the woman who had bid highest on lot 47. That woman dropped her chocolate ballet slippers, and those slippers fell on Count Olaf's boots, and those boots fell on 3 more doilies that made 4 more people slip and fall on one another, and soon the entire crowd was in a hopeless tangle. But the Baudelaires did not even glance back to see the latest grief that the doilies had caused. They kept their eyes on the pair of loathsome people who were running down the steps of Veblen Hall toward a big black pickup truck. Behind the wheel of the pickup truck was the doorman, who had finally done the sensible thing and rolled up his oversized sleeves, but that must have been a difficult task, for as the children gazed into the truck, they caught a glimpse of 2 hooks where the doorman's hands should have been. "The hook-handed man?" Klaus cried. "He was right under our noses the entire time." Count Olaf turned to sneer at the children just as he reached the pickup truck. "He might have been right under your noses," he snarled, "but soon he will be at your throats. I'll be back, Baudelaires. Soon the Quagmire sapphires will be mine, but I haven't forgotten about your fortune." "Gnope!" Sunny shrieked, and Violet was quick to translate. "Where are Duncan and Isadora?" she said. "Where have you taken them?" Olaf and Esme looked at one another and burst into laughter as they slipped into the black truck. Esme jerked a long-nailed thumb toward the flatbed, which is the word for the back part of a pickup where things are stored. "We used 2 red herrings to fool you," she said, as the truck's engine roared to life. The children could see in the back of the truck the big red herring that had been lot 48 in the inn auction. "The Quagmires!" Klaus cried. "Olaf has trapped them inside the statue." The orphans raced down the steps of the hall, and once again you may find it more pleasant to put down this book and close your eyes and imagine a better ending to this tale than the one that I must write. You may imagine, for instance, that as the Baudelaires reached the truck, they heard the sound of the engine stalling instead of the tooting of the horn as the hook-handed man drove his bosses away. You may imagine that the children heard the sounds of the Quagmires escaping from the statue of the herring, instead of the word toodaloo coming from Esme's villainous mouth. And you may imagine the sounds of police sirens as Count Olaf was caught at last, instead of the weeping of the Baudelaire orphans as the black truck rounded the corner and disappeared from view. But your imaginings would be ersatz, as all imaginings are. They are as untrue as the ersatz auctioneer who found the Baudelaires at the squalor's penthouse, and the ersatz elevator outside their front door, and the ersatz guardian who pushed them down the deep pit of the elevator shaft. Esme hid her evil plan behind her reputation as the city's 6th most important financial advisor, and Count Olaf hid his identity behind a monocle and some black boots. And the dark passageway hid its secrets behind a pair of sliding elevator doors. But as much as it pains me to tell you that the Baudelaire orphans stood on the steps of Veblen Hall, weeping with anguish and frustration as Count Olaf rode away with the Quagmire triplets, I cannot hide the unfortunate truths of the Baudelaire's lives behind an ersatz happy ending. The Baudelaire orphans stood on the steps of Veblen Hall, weeping with anguish and frustration as Count Olaf rode away with the Quagmire triplets, and the sight of Mr. Poe emerging from the award-winning door with a doily in his hair and a look of panic in his eye only made them weep harder. "I'll call the police," Mr. Poe said, "and they'll capture Count Olaf in no time at all." The Baudelaires knew that this statement was as ersatz as Gunther's improper English. They knew that Olaf was far too clever to be captured by the police. And I'm sorry to say that by the time 2 detectives found the big black pickup truck abandoned outside St. Carl's Cathedral with the motor still running, Olaf had already transferred the Quagmires from the red herring to a shiny black instrument case, which he told the bus driver was a tuba he was bringing to his aunt. The 3 siblings watched Mr. Poe scurry back into Veblen Hall to ask members of the inn crowd where he could find a phone booth, and they knew that the banker was not going to be of any help. "I think Mr. Poe will be a great deal of help," Jerome said as he walked out of Veblen Hall and sat down on the steps to try to comfort the children. "He's going to call the police and give them a description of Olaf." "But Olaf is always in disguise," Violet said miserably, wiping her eyes. "You never know what he'll look like until you see him." "Well, I'm going to make sure you never see him again," Jerome promised. "Esme may have left, and I'm not going to argue with her. But I'm still your guardian, and I'm going to take you far, far away from here. So far away that you'll forget all about Count Olaf and the Quagmires and everything else." "Forget about Olaf?" Klaus asked. "How can we forget about him? We'll never forget his treachery, no matter where we live." "And we'll never forget the Quagmires either," Violet said. "I don't want to forget about them. We have to figure out where he's taking our friends and how to rescue them." "Turkle," Sunny said, which meant something along the lines of, "and we don't want to forget about everything else either, like the underground hallway that led to our ruined mansion and the real meaning of VFD." My sister is right, Klaus said. We have to track down Olaf and learn all the secrets he's keeping from us. We're not going to track down Olaf, Jerome said, shuddering at the thought. We'll be lucky if he doesn't track us down. As your guardian, I cannot allow you to try to find such a dangerous man. Wouldn't you rather live safely with me? Yes, Violet admitted, but our friends are in grave danger. We must go and rescue them. Well, I don't want to argue, Jerome said. If you've made up your mind, then you've made up your mind. I'll tell Mr. Poe to find you another guardian. You mean you won't help us? Klaus asked. Jerome sighed and kissed each Baudelaire on the forehead. You children are very, very dear to me, he said, but I don't have your courage. Your mother always said I wasn't brave enough, and I guess she was right. Good luck, Baudelaires. I think you will need it. The children watched in amazement as Jerome walked away, not even looking back at the 3 orphans he was leaving behind. They found their eyes brimming with tears once more as they watched him disappear from sight. They would never see the squalor penthouse again, or spend another night in their bedrooms, or even spend a moment in their oversized pinstripe suits. Though he was not as dastardly as Esme, or Count Olaf, or the hook-handed man, Jerome was still an Ersatz guardian, because a real guardian is supposed to provide a home, with a place to sleep and something to wear, and all Jerome had given them in the end was good luck. Jerome reached the end of the block and turned left, and the Baudelaires were once again alone in this world. Violet sighed and stared down the street in the direction Olaf had escaped. I hope my inventing skills don't fail me, she said, because we're going to need more than good luck to rescue the Quagmire triplets. Klaus sighed and stared down the street in the direction of the ashy remains of their first home. I hope my research skills don't fail me, he said, because we're going to need more than good luck to solve the mystery of the hallway and the Baudelaire mansion. Sunny sighed and watched as a lone doily blew down the stairs. Bite, she said, and she meant that she hoped her teeth wouldn't fail her because they need more than good luck to discover what VFD really stood for. The Baudelaires looked at one another with faint smiles. They were smiling because they didn't think Violet's inventing skills would fail, any more than Klaus's research skills would fail or Sunny's teeth would fail. But the children also knew that they wouldn't fail each other, as Jerome had failed them, and as Mr. Poe was failing them now, as he dialed the wrong number and was talking to a Vietnamese restaurant instead of the police. No matter how many misfortunes had befallen them, and no matter how many Ersatz things they would encounter in the future, the Baudelaire orphans knew they could rely on each other for the rest of their lives, and this at least felt like the one thing in the world that was true. End of the Ersatz elevator. I'd feel bad if a man ever takes me on a nice date and finds out how much I enjoy eating. He'll just be impressed. There are 13 books in the series. And I'm also, yes, I am also reading, don't forget, I'm also reading the Nancy Drew books that the games are based on in between series of unfortunate events. I've got no shortage of books, this is true. Did I say Torkel? Terror. The book reading was good too. Before I end, though, I am gonna read he always does a preview for the next book. Okay, let me read the preview for the next book. To my kind editor, I am sorry this paper is sopping wet, but I am writing this from the place where the Quagmire triplets were hidden. The next time you run out of milk, buy a new carton at cash register number 19 of the Not Very Supermarket. When you arrive home, you will find my description of the Baudelaire's recent experiences in this dreadful town, entitled The Vile Village, has been tucked into your grocery sack, along with a burnt-out torch, the tip of a harpoon, and a chart of the migration paths of the VFD crows. There is also a copy of the official portrait of the Council of Elders to help Mr. Hellquist with his illustrations. Remember, you are my last hope that the tales of the Baudelaire orphans can finally be told to the general public. With all due respect, Lemony Snicket. The end. He will be glad that he doesn't have to share fries, as you would always ask for a portion of your own. Well, unless he's Tori and I have an understanding. That's true. Holland does eat what I don't finish. She waits till I'm done, and then she's like, are you gonna eat that? And I'm like, no, and she's like, okay. Yep. Or Holland will be like, do you want this? And I'll be like, yes. And she'll be like, okay. Yeah. Alright, guys. That's it. Thank you so much for hanging out with me. It's 11:30, so I still have plenty of time to eat and chill before work, which makes me very excited. Thank you guys so much for joining me. Tomorrow, there is a possibility that I will be called in to do a special project at work. If that happens, I will be at work from 9 till about 1. So I plan to push my stream of Ocarina of Time until I'm home. So I will probably be going live between 1:30 and 2 EST. And then I'll go for about 2 hours like normal. And then I have plans with Holland and Mom tomorrow evening. So that's kind of my plan. Thank you so much for hanging out. Thank you so much. As I said, thank you for hanging out. I hope it was chill. Thank you for being here. I hope you guys enjoy the rest of your days today. I'll see you around, hopefully, as I can. Take care of yourselves, as always. I'll see you soon. I'll leave you with a little more music. But until then, take care of yourselves. I'll see you guys soon. Bye. Much love from me to you. I almost forgot my part. Much love from me to you. Bye-bye. Nice.